Somewhere in the middle of a battlefield soaked in blood, a dying man reaches into his armor and pulls out a piece of cloth. Not a weapon, not a prayer, a handkerchief. And if you understand why that small piece of fabric was the last thing Kristen Cole ever touched, you understand why tens of thousands of people are dead because of him. Kristen Cole was never supposed to matter. He was born the son of a steward, lowborn by Westerosi standards, raised in the Dornish marches under Lord Dondarrion, which already tells you something about the kind of man he'd become. Since that's a region shaped by centuries of border warfare with Dorne, he earned his reputation the hard way, not through blood or birthright, but through the sword, becoming one of the most gifted fighters of his generation. At the Maiden's Tourney, he outperformed every highborn knight sent against him, humiliating men who were born into privilege he could never claim. It's the kind of underdog story that should have made him beloved. Instead, it planted the first seed of what would eventually consume him. Because when a man has to earn everything through violence and skill while others are handed titles from birth, that man tends to develop a very specific relationship with pride. He joined the Kingsguard, swore the vows, gave up his name, his house, his future children, everything, to protect the royal family. And this is where it gets messy, because Kristen Cole didn't just protect Rhaenyra Targaryen. He fell in love with her. Whether that love was returned in the way he believed it was returned is one of the most debated points in the entire history of the Dance of the Dragons, but what matters is what Kristen believed. He believed they had something real. He believed, even for a moment, that a future existed where he could leave the Kingsguard, marry her, and live as her husband rather than her sworn shadow. Rhaenyra, according to the sources, entertained the idea only briefly before reality set back in. She was the heir to the Iron Throne. He was a landless knight who had sworn away his ability to marry anyone. There was no version of their story that ended with a wedding. When she rejected him, and worse, when she moved on to Harwin Strong not long after, Kristen didn't just experience heartbreak. He experienced what he saw as total humiliation, a private wound made worse by his own pride. This is the part people miss when they talk about Kristen Cole. He wasn't a villain born evil. He was a man whose entire identity was built on earning respect through excellence. And now the one person who mattered most to him had, in his mind, discarded him like he was nothing more than a body to pass the time with. From that moment forward, every decision Kristen Cole made was on the surface about duty, about honor, about the realm. But underneath, it was always about proving he mattered. It was always about punishing the woman who made him feel like he didn't. Once Kristen shifted his loyalty toward Alison Hightower and the Greens, he didn't just become another sword for their cause. He became its engine. This matters because most of the men swirling around the throne during this period were driven by politics, by legacy, by the desire to protect their bloodline's claim. Kristen was driven by something rawer. He needed Rhaenyra to lose, not just politically, but personally. So when the moment came to publicly humiliate her children by declaring them bastards, born of another man's seed and not Laenor Valerian's, it was Kristen who pushed hardest for that path, knowing exactly how much damage those words would do. He wasn't simply stating a political fact to weaken a rival claimant. He was tearing down the family Rhaenyra built with another man, the family that existed because she chose someone else over him. Every insult he hurled at her children carried the weight of his own rejection. This is why Alison Hightower found Kristen Cole so useful and, frankly, so easy to manipulate in the early stages of their alliance. She didn't need to convince him to hate Rhaenyra. He already did. All she had to do was give him a stage to act on it and a cause noble enough to disguise what was really personal vengeance. And Kristen, desperate for the validation and purpose he lost the day Rhaenyra rejected him, gave Alicent something even more valuable than his sword. He gave her his complete, unwavering devotion. Not to the realm. Not even really to Aegon II, the boy he helped crown. To her, to Alicent. Watch how differently Kristen behaves around Alicent compared to everyone else in the small council. Where other men calculate and hedge, Kristen commits fully, aggressively, sometimes recklessly, because in his mind he's not just serving a queen dowager, he's earning back the dignity he lost. He's proving that he is not a man who can be discarded. This obsessive devotion becomes the engine behind decision after decision that spirals the realm toward war. The Blacks and the Greens didn't need to go to war immediately after Viserys died. There were paths toward negotiation, toward compromise, toward avoiding the deaths of tens of thousands of small folk who had no stake in which Targaryen sat the throne. But Kristen Cole, more than almost anyone else in that small council, pushed for confrontation, for decisive action, for war. Because peace meant nothing to him. Peace meant Rhaenyra continuing to live her life, continuing to be happy, continuing to exist as the woman who chose someone else. War gave him purpose again. War gave him the chance to be the hero he always believed he deserved to be. The hero worthy of being loved rather than discarded. By the time Kristen Cole leads his men into what becomes known as the Butcher's Ball, he is a man completely consumed by his need for a glorious death. He talks openly about wanting songs sung of his bravery, about dying in a blaze of legend rather than fading into old age as a forgotten knight. This isn't the talk of a soldier focused on victory. This is the talk of a man who has already decided his life has no other meaning left to give except a spectacular ending. And that's exactly what makes the handkerchief detail so devastating once you notice it. Tucked inside his armor, against his chest, through every battle, through every slaughter he orders, through the deaths of thousands of men who trusted him to lead them wisely, Kristen Cole carries a handkerchief given to him by Alison Hightower. It's a small, intimate token, the kind lovers exchange, the kind meant to be a private comfort in a private moment. But Kristen isn't carrying it privately. He's carrying it into a war that has already cost an unthinkable number of lives. A war that started, at its core, because of his wounded pride and his need to prove himself worthy of love. That handkerchief is the queen's favor, and in the old tradition of knights fighting for a lady's honor, it's supposed to represent something noble, something romantic in the classical sense. But strip away the romance and look at what it actually represents here. It represents a grown man, one of the most feared and skilled fighters in Westeros, reducing an entire war, an entire civil conflict that will be remembered for generations as the Dance of the Dragons, down to the same wounded, jealous, desperate need for validation that started the moment Rhaenyra chose someone else over him. Every arrow fired at the Butcher's Ball, every soldier who dies outnumbered nearly 200 to 1 in a trap that should never have been walked into so blindly, exists because Kristen Cole never actually got over being rejected. He dressed it up as duty. He dressed it up as loyalty to Alicent and the rightful line of succession. But that handkerchief against his chest tells the real story. It's not the symbol of a soldier fighting for his queen. It's the symbol of a man who never stopped fighting for the approval of a woman who could give him what Rhaenyra never did, and who was willing to burn the realm down proving it. Here's where the story becomes almost unbearably poetic, in the darkest way possible. Kristen Cole spent his entire life becoming one of the finest swordsmen Westeros had ever seen. He built his identity around combat, around the idea that skill and honor in battle were the things that made a man worthy of respect. He wanted to die a hero's death, a death worthy of songs, a death that would finally, permanently, prove he mattered. Instead, he dies exactly the way he mocked his enemies for dying. Not through swordplay, not through a legendary duel against a worthy opponent. He dies from an arrow, fired by Alysanne Blackwood, a skilled archer who simply does what any smart soldier does when facing an outnumbered, overconfident enemy commander. There's no glory in it. There's no song-worthy moment of clashing steel. It's brutally efficient, almost anticlimactic. Exactly the kind of death Kristen himself once dismissed as unworthy of a true warrior, when he mocked how the finest swordsman of his era, the man he spent his life trying to erase and outdo, met his own end the same unglamorous way. And that's not a coincidence the story wants you to miss. Kristen Cole dedicated years of his life trying to invalidate that man's legacy, trying to prove he was the better knight, the more honorable knight, the knight who deserved the love and respect that man received. And in the end, he dies exactly the same way, felled by an arrow rather than a sword, denied the heroic ending he spent his whole life chasing. When his body falls, the handkerchief is still there, still clutched or still tucked close, the final piece of evidence that everything, from his defection to the Greens, to his ruthless push for war, to the thousands of deaths under his command, all traces back to one wounded, prideful heart that never recovered from being told he wasn't enough. That's the real tragedy hiding underneath all the politics and dragons and prophecy in this story. Kristen Cole wasn't fighting for a king. He wasn't fighting for the realm. He was fighting until his very last breath for a woman's approval he needed just to feel like his life meant something. And an entire war was the price everyone else paid for it. So next time you rewatch that scene, don't just see a battle. Look for the handkerchief. Because once you see it, you can't unsee what it says about the man wearing it, and about how personal wounds, left to fester long enough, can end up rewriting the fate of an entire kingdom. Let me know down in the comments if you caught this detail the first time around, and if you think Kristen Cole deserves any sympathy at all after everything he did. Here's the part a lot of viewers skip past because they're too busy processing the shock of watching one of the show's most feared men go down so quickly. Kristen Cole's death isn't just a dramatic beat, it's a structural turning point for the entire Greens cause, and the fallout from it says just as much about him as the handkerchief did. For years, Kristen was the one steady, terrifying constant standing between the Greens and total collapse. Whatever you think of his motives, the man could win battles, and everyone on both sides knew it. Take him off the board and suddenly the war looks completely different. Aegon too now has to figure out how to lead a war effort without the one general who actually had command experience and battlefield instinct. And that's a massive problem, because nothing in Aegon's arc up to this point suggests he's built for that kind of pressure. Watch how quickly the tone shifts at court once word of the Butcher's Ball reaches King's Landing. It's not just grief. It's panic, because Kristen's death exposes just how thin the Greens' military leadership actually is without him. He was never just a soldier following orders, he was the plan. And that reveals something uncomfortable about the whole Greens operation from the start. It was never actually built on solid strategy or a broadly supported claim to the throne. It was propped up by personal loyalty, by men like Kristen who fought not because the cause made sense, but because it gave them purpose, or power, or in his case, a shot at redemption. Once that emotional engine is gone, the machine doesn't run the same way anymore. There's also the ripple effect this has on Alison Hightower, the woman that handkerchief was tied to in the first place. Alison spends the back half of this story increasingly isolated, increasingly aware that the war she helped start has spiraled completely out of her control. And Kristen's death is one more piece of evidence that the people she trusted to protect her family are dying for reasons that have nothing to do with protecting anyone. If Kristen was fighting this entire war to prove his devotion to her, his death arguably proves the opposite of what he wanted. It doesn't cement his legacy as her noble knight. It becomes one more body in a pile of bodies that Alison now has to carry the weight of, whether she asked for that weight or not. There's a bitter irony sitting right underneath the surface here. Kristen wanted a death that would be remembered, sung about, immortalized as proof that he mattered. Instead, his death becomes just another causality report. Another name added to a war that was already spiraling past anyone's ability to control it, remembered less as a hero's final stand and more as a costly, humiliating defeat that weakens the side he died for. And that's really the final piece of what makes this whole handkerchief thread so tragic when you zoom all the way out. Kristen Cole spent his life trying to write his own story, trying to be the exception, the low-born knight who proved through skill and devotion that he deserved to matter just as much as any high-born lord. But the story he actually ends up writing is a cautionary one, about what happens when personal wounds get mistaken for principle, when private heartbreak gets dressed up as public duty, and when a man convinces himself that enough violence can finally fill the hole left behind by rejection. It never does. It just gets bigger, and it takes everyone standing near him down with it. So when people ask why the Dance of the Dragons became as brutal and prolonged as it did, the honest answer isn't just dragons, or succession law, or ancient prophecy. Sometimes the biggest wars in history come down to something as small and human as one man who couldn't let go of being told no. Kristen Cole is proof of that, carried quite literally next to his heart until his very last moment. If this kind of deep character breakdown is what you come to this channel for, let me know in the comments which character you want dissected next, because there are plenty more hidden details like this one still waiting to be unpacked. Before we close this one out, there's a harder question sitting underneath everything we just walked through. And it's the kind of question that changes how you see this entire story once you actually sit with it. What if Rhaenyra had said yes? Not to marriage exactly, since we already covered why that was never realistically on the table for a Kingsguard knight and a Targaryen heir. But what if she had handled the rejection differently? What if she'd given Kristen a gentler landing instead of moving on so quickly and so visibly with Harwin Strong? Would any of this still have happened? It's tempting to say no, that a kinder rejection would have spared the realm from the Butcher's Ball, from tens of thousands of dead small folk, from a knight so broken by heartbreak that he became the architect of a war. But that theory gives Kristen Cole a little too much credit, and honestly, it lets him off the hook in a way the story never really intends to. Because pride like his doesn't heal with kindness. It heals with humility, with the ability to sit inside disappointment and grow from it instead of needing to burn the world down to prove it never happened. Kristen never had that ability, and that's not Rhaenyra's failure, that's his. She rejected one man's romantic advances. She didn't force him into the Greens camp. She didn't force him to slaughter thousands of soldiers outnumbered 200 to 1 just to feel powerful again. And she certainly didn't force him to carry another woman's favor into battle like some twisted trophy, proving he'd moved on when clearly, watching how obsessively devoted he became to Alison, he never actually did. This is worth sitting with because it says something bigger about how this entire story treats power, pride, and rejection among men who are used to earning everything through force. Kristen Cole isn't the only character in this universe who turns personal humiliation into political catastrophe. And honestly, once you notice the pattern with him, you'll start seeing it everywhere else too. Watch how many of the worst decisions made throughout this war trace back to someone's wounded ego rather than any genuine belief in the righteousness of their cause. That's the quiet, uncomfortable thesis sitting underneath the dragons and the politics and the ancient prophecies. This isn't really a story about who has the better claim to the throne. It's a story about what happens when powerful people are never taught how to lose gracefully, how to be told no and simply accept it, how to feel small without needing to make someone else feel smaller in return. Kristen Cole had the talent to be remembered as one of the greatest knights in Westerosi history. Instead, he'll be remembered as the man who let one rejection define the rest of his life, who dressed vengeance up as duty so convincingly that he may have even fooled himself. And that handkerchief, the one he carried against his chest through every battle, through every order that sent more men to their deaths, was never really a symbol of love at all. It was a symbol of everything he still hadn't let go of. So the next time someone tells you this war started because of dragons and succession law, remind them it actually started, in one very real sense, with a man who couldn't take no for an answer, and never stopped trying to make everyone else pay for it. That's it for this breakdown. If you want more deep dives like this one, unpacking the small details hiding in plain sight throughout the show, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more still to uncover before this season wraps up.